Hello, I'm Nate, aka B-Tier Mutineer, and today, as part of my B-Tier guides, I'm going to take you through a build guide for Morrigan in Dragon Age Origins. Morrigan is a mage, and mages are quite overpowered, even if they aren't built perfectly. Spells just tend to be much better than weapon abilities. As a side note, I'm going to be talking about Morrigan's initial skills and spells on PC because that's the platform that I play on, so that's the only one I can offer advice for. You can still use most of my advice for the console version of the game too, but know that some of her starting abilities are slightly different, and you also can't use mods on consoles. Morrigan starts off, unfortunately, with a few useless spells, and worse, a useless specialization. The Shapeshifter specialization is very cool as an idea, but the devs didn't give enough usable abilities to the shapeshifted forms in order to make shapeshifting viable. There are ways to make it pretty good, but only if you focus very hard on min-maxing the shapeshifter build. If you're interested in that, there is a shapeshifter build guide made by Kis Hercheg that you can find on YouTube. For my Morrigan build guide, however, I will ask you to completely ignore the shapeshifter specialization, as well as the spider shape that she starts out with and possibly bear shape if you somehow get Morrigan at level 8. If you have her specialization mod, this is a place where I recommend respecializing Morrigan so that she's not a shapeshifter anymore. Even if that contradicts the lore of the game, in terms of gameplay and combat, there's really no reason to have shapeshifter spells. From the primal spell tree, she starts with Winter's Grasp and then Lightning if she's level 6, and Frost Weapons if she's level 7. Winter's Grasp is a wonderful spell because it has a chance to freeze enemies, and any form of CC or crowd control is incredibly useful in the game. You want to use Winter's Grasp against most enemies other than undead because undead have cold resistance. Lightning is good because any form of lightning damage also drains some of the target's mana or stamina. Enemies having less energy to use abilities with is always a good thing. Frost weapons are good, but they're not as useful against as many enemies as flaming weapons. You want to use it when fighting demons, dragons, and spiders. Remember that undead are resistant to cold, so switch to another weapon enchantment when fighting them. From the spirit tree, Morrigan starts off with Mind Blast. This is another great CC spell. It will stun all enemies around the caster. Very useful for when Morrigan is surrounded by enemies. Use Mind Blast to stun them, then run away to put some distance between her and the enemies so that they don't attack her once they shake off the stun. From the Entropy tree, Morrigan starts off with Vulnerability Hex, Disorient, Drain Life, and Horror, the latter only if she's level 7. Vulnerability Hex is a good debuff to reduce enemies' elemental resistances and can also be used as a combo with Drain Life to improve its effect. I recommend using Vulnerability Hex on tankier enemies or otherwise high priority ones like mages or assassin that you want to kill first. There's not much point in using it on a basic enemy who's going to die quickly anyway, that's just a waste of mana. Disorient is, as far as I'm concerned, a pretty useless spell. It targets an enemy and reduces its attack and defense by 5 each. Extremely early on, like during your adventures in Lothering Village and a bit afterwards, this spell may have some use, as enemies won't have very high attack and defense stats at that level. So a -5 penalty will still mean something. However, once you're level 9 or above, I'd say it loses any usefulness. I like Drain Life a lot because it's a cheap spell, it does spirit damage to an enemy so it can be improved by Vulnerability Hex, and it will also heal Morrigan a little bit. Horror, which Morrigan starts out with if she's level 7 when you get her, is a great CC spell, but in my opinion not quite as good as some of the other ones. Horror makes a target cower in fear, unable to move unless it passes a mental resistance check. I found that quite a few enemies tend to resist this effect, and some are also immune to it. You can also combine it with the Sleep spell, cast Sleep and then Horror to create the combo known as Nightmare, dealing a lot of spirit damage to the target. In terms of gear, Morrigan starts with Morrigan's Robes, a Magic Staff, and the Amulet Wildstone Clasp. Morrigan's robes aren't terrible, but there's other mage robes out there that are much better. However, you do lose Morrigan's unique visual model if you equip her with regular mage robes. In my opinion, unless you're playing at a high difficulty, you can keep Morrigan's robes or the other Morrigan-specific robes that you can get from her personal quest without issue. I do recommend switching the magic staff to at least an enchanter's staff as soon as possible because the basic magic staff kind of sucks. Wildstone Clasp isn't bad as it gives Morrigan willpower and mental resistance, but as I mentioned in my Alistair build guide for his starting accessory, it's good to replace it as soon as you have a better one. I'll go through what I consider to be the potentially most useful spells you can use on Morrigan based on her starting ones to be more consistent with her character as well as not wasting level up points to get a single useful spell at the end of a tree. But before that, when Morrigan first levels up, I highly recommend getting the heal spell so that you can keep your party alive more easily without using as many healing potions. You can even set it up in her tactics for her to use heal when an ally is under 50% HP or under 25% HP. The two passives at the end of the Arcane Bolt tree, Staff Focus and Arcane Mastery, are great. Staff Focus increases Morrigan's damage with basic staff attacks. Arcane Mastery gives her a bonus to spell power, thus increasing the effectiveness and damage of all her spells. I recommend getting these passives later on in the game, as you will have to go through Arcane Bolt and Arcane Shield to get them, and those two aren't so good. From the creation tree, I've mentioned getting the heal spell as soon as possible. I personally don't bother with the rest of the creation tree on Morrigan, as she doesn't seem to be the type to focus on learning them. If anything, you could get the Glyph of Paralysis, which paralyzes the first enemy who crosses its bounds, unless it passes a physical resistance check. The primal spells are the best of the bunch and go well with Morrigan's wilder nature. Flame Blast is a great cone of fire spell to damage enemies in front of you. Friendly fire is possible. Flaming Weapons is a great sustained, enchanting all the party's melee weapons to do extra fire damage. Against Darkspawn, which are your main enemy, fire damage is best as they're vulnerable to it. Fireball is, well, exactly like Fireball in most RPGs. Big ball of fire that does fire damage to all creatures in an area, friendly fire possible, and also has a chance to knock them down. I think that Inferno, Blizzard, Earthquake, Tempest, and Chain Lightning are a bit overkill because they tend to affect a huge area. Friendly fire is possible. Rock Armor is a good defensive sustained spell. It gives Morrigan a bonus to armor, so that means whenever she's hit, she takes less damage per attack. Stone Fist is my favorite spell together with Winter's Grasp, and you can even use it on a frozen enemy or a petrified one to have a chance to shatter them. Petrify is a great CC skill, and as mentioned earlier, can be comboed with Stone Fist or with a critical hit from one of your weapon-wielding companions to try to shatter enemies. Cone of Cold is even better than Flame Blast in my opinion, because it can freeze enemies, which can then also be possibly shattered by a critical hit or Stone Fist. Shock is a Cone of Lightning spell that's good, because lightning damage, as mentioned previously, drains mana or stamina from targets, but if you're already taking Cone of Cold and or Flame Blast, you may not want to take a third Cone of Damage spell. From the Spirit Tree, I personally only use spells from the last row, in particular Mind Blast, Telekinetic Weapons, and Crushing Prison. Mind Blast I've already explained. Telekinetic Weapons gives a bonus to armor penetration to all melee weapons in the party, which can be incredibly useful against enemies with heavy armor. In some cases, enemies have high elemental resistances and high armor, so instead of using flame or frost weapons, it's far more useful to use telekinetic weapons to melt through their armor. Crushing Prison is a powerful spell that CCs an enemy, enclosing them in a collapsing cage of telekinetic force, dealing spirit damage. From the Entropy tree, there is a lot of good spells. Weakness is a stronger version of Disorient, inflicting penalties of -10 to both attack and defense, as opposed to the -5 of Disorient, and it also reduces the target's movement speed unless it passes a check. Paralyze and Mass Paralyze are amazing CC spells, with Mass Paralyze targeting all hostile targets in an area. Affliction Hex is better than the Vulnerability Hex because it's a contagious one, inflicting elemental resistance penalties on the target and all other enemies nearby. Misdirection Hex is very powerful against damager non-mage enemies, making all their regular hits turn into misses and their critical hits becoming normal hits. Death Hex makes every normal hit the target suffers become a critical hit, meaning it will take a lot of damage from attacks. Do be aware of the fact that mage attacks and spells can't crit, however, so if you use Death Hex, I recommend only having one mage in the group so that you can take full advantage of the crits. Sleep is great if you want to combo it with the horror spell to create the nightmare effect. From the row with the Drain Life spell, the spell we're interested in most is Curse of Mortality. This is a hell of a spell that is so annoying when enemies hit you with it, because the target is cursed to be unable to heal or regenerate any health and takes continuous spirit damage. I highly recommend having this spell on your side. Since Morrigan already starts with the Shapeshifter specialization, you'll only be able to choose one specialization for her at level 14. I recommend Spirit Healer, despite it not being perhaps the most characterization-friendly specialization on the surface, but Morrigan is a very practical person who sees the benefit of keeping her allies alive, so in my opinion it's not so out of character for her to learn how to heal more effectively. Unlocking the specialization gives a bonus to +2 to magic and some combat health regeneration. Most importantly, it gives you access to 4 amazing spells: Group Heal, Revival, Life Ward, and Cleansing Aura. Group Heal does exactly what it says on the tin, and I recommend using it to heal all of your allies instead of using Heal whenever you see that 2 or more party members are under 50% HP. Revival lets you restore a fallen party member from unconsciousness and restores some health. Do note that you'll have to either make them drink a potion or heal them immediately after revival, since they won't have very much health. Life Ward is a great spell to cast at the start of combat on the party's tank that automatically restores health when the ally's health first falls under 33%. Cleansing Aura is an amazing sustained spell. With this spell active, you restore health to all nearby allies every few seconds, as well as cure the injuries of allies very close to the caster. The second property of this spell means that you never have to use injury kits or travel to camp to cure party's injuries ever again. I don't recommend using this spell during combat because it does make your mana regeneration much slower, but I do recommend using it after combat is finished if any ally fell unconscious so that you can cure them of any injuries. For skills, Morrigan starts out with 2 ranks in combat training and 2 ranks in herbalism. Other than a side quest that requires master herbalism, I personally don't find any reason to unlock any additional ranks in herbalism for Morrigan. I make the cheapest versions of health poultices and lyrium potions with her herbalism skill, and that's it. I recommend maxing out her combat training skill as it ensures she can take more damage before it interrupts her spellcasting. Other than that, though, I recommend putting points either in survival for extra nature resistance or in tactics if you want to give more tactic slots to Morrigan so that you can set up her AI behavior to do what you need her to do without micromanaging her so much. I do recommend keeping an eye on your mages though, because if they have too many spells in their tactics, they tend to run out of mana too quickly, and then they'll be pretty much useless unless you also tell them to drink lyrium potions when they're low on mana. For Morrigan's attributes, I recommend you mainly put points in magic and willpower. I like to put 2 points in magic and 1 point in willpower whenever I level up a mage. Additionally, if you'd like to get some ranks or even max out the survival skill for Morrigan, you'll need her to have 16 cunning for that. There's a bunch of gear that can give her extra health, so I don't recommend putting any points in constitution. For tactics, I mainly recommend using the damager preset for Morrigan, especially early on because she has a lot of damaging spells in her starting kit. When you give her the heal spell, however, do ensure to set up tactics to heal an ally when they're under 50 or 25% HP, as that's a very important spell for her to use. Also make sure that Morrigan is using the correct sustained spell whenever combat begins, such as the right weapon enchantment, or rock armor, or whatever other sustained spell you may want to be active. Let's talk about gear. As a note, I'm not mentioning gear that you can only get very late in the game or gear that's very difficult to acquire. For magic staffs or staves, whatever you want to call them, here are some good ones. I've already mentioned the enchanter's staff as a good early game upgrade for the magic staff Morrigan starts out with. It's a perfectly good staff to use since it has cold, electricity, and fire damage, but if you really want to improve Morrigan's spells, staffs are where you can make a huge difference. The Corrupted Magister's Staff is a DLC item that gives spell power, spirit damage, and possible paralysis. You find it during Return to Ostacar. It's a little bit finicky to get, but if you have Dane's fixes, you can easily find it no matter what you did during your initial time in Ostacar. Staff of the Magister Lord is an extremely expensive staff, but it is worth it. It has willpower, huge mana regeneration, spell power, as well as both spirit and fire damage bonuses. Torch of Embers is a good staff with fire resistance, fire damage, and spell power bonuses that you can buy at the Wonders of Thedas shop in Denerim. It's quite effective against Darkspawn and Undead. Winter's Breath, on the other hand, is the cold version of Torch of Embers. Similarly, it's bought at the Wonders of Thedas shop in Denerim. Torch of Embers is cheaper and more generally useful, so if you only buy one of these, get Torch of Embers. You could also buy both Torch of Embers and Winter's Breath and use them alternatively, switching between them depending on the types of enemies you face. And do know that you can switch your gear during combat. For Morrigan's chess piece, I recommend the Robes of Possession that you can get by doing Morrigan's personal quest, as they have the same model as Morrigan's robes and have good stats. Due to the 20% bonus to cold damage that these have, you may want to take Cone of Cold alongside Winter's Grasp to make good use of it. Other than these unique robes, other good ones are First Enchanter's Robes, purchasable from Caesar's special stock in Denerim, Senior Enchanter's Robes, purchasable from the merchant in the Denerim Alienage and from the one in Orzammar's Dusttown, or the Tevinter Enchanter's Robes. Reaper's Vestments, a very expensive robe from the Wonders of Thedas shop in Denerim, and Vestments of the Seer, an item earned by completing the Witch Hunt DLC, get a special mention. Reaper's Vestments are truly the best mage robes in the game, but they're hugely expensive. So depending on who else you have in your party and what you want to purchase for them, you may not want to spend all your gold on robes. Personally, if I bother changing Morrigan's model into a default one by using one of these other robes, I might as well go for the best one, or at least one that has a bonus to dodge chance. For headgear, despite all of them being extremely ugly, I recommend the Libertarian's Cowl, which can be looted during the Mage's main quest. You can also use an Enchanter Cowl, which can randomly be looted or bought from the Wonders of Thedas in Denerim. For gloves, it depends on the spells that you give Morrigan. Personally, I don't think glove choice matters all that much. Throughout the game, you'll find various light gloves that have a mage class requirement, and they all give a bonus to damage with a certain element. There's gloves with a 10% bonus and gloves with a 20% bonus. Obviously, the gloves with a 20% bonus are superior, but may be difficult to acquire. The only gloves I recommend not using are the ones that give a bonus to nature damage. Very few spells actually do nature damage, and many enemies are resistant to nature damage anyway, so increasing it is not worth it. But really, gloves are the weakest component of a mage's gear in my opinion. For boots, there's a few good choices. The Bard's Dancing Shoes give defense and reduce hostility, though if you don't have the Dane's Fixes mod, then the reduces hostility property does nothing. Enchanter's Footing is a mage-restricted pair of boots that give +6 to defense and can be looted from the Korcari Wilds during the quest A Pinch of Ashes, or bought from the Quartermaster at Ostagar. Imperial Weavers give a +10% chance to dodge. The Lion's Paw, a DLC item, is in my opinion the best pair of boots for someone wearing light armor, as they give extra armor, 10% chance to dodge, and a chance to avoid missile attacks. I don't recommend the Magus War Boots even though they give +12 to defense, because they require you to complete the whole Summoning Sciences side quest, and I know that it can be a confusing quest for many and a tedious quest for others, and I often skip it myself. Now for the accessories. As I've mentioned in my Alistair build guide, there are quite a few items that are highly contested and expensive that are pretty much good for everyone. The Andrew's Blessing and Cinch of Skillful Maneuvering belts, the Spell Ward and the Hyrule Guard of House Dace amulets, and the Life Giver, Ring of Ages, and Key to the City rings. As always, I won't be recommending those because it's up to you to choose who you want to equip them on, as well as if you want or can afford to purchase them at all. For belts, here are some good ones. Belt of the Magister Lords gives +3 to spell power, and is found at the end of the Gauntlet during the Urn of Sacred Ashes quest. The Destructionist Belt gives mana regeneration in combat and +3 to spell power, and can be bought from Bruck in Ortine Tig in the Deep Roads. Finally, the Court of Shattered Dreams, acquired during the Golem and Homeneath quest, is a DLC item that gives +3 to spell power and +10 to mental resistance. I prefer using a belt with spell power or one of the highly contested belts, but you can also use this one. I will mention the Sash of Forbidden Secrets, but this requires you to earn the Reaper achievement by killing the Harvester in the Golems of Amgarok DLC, and that DLC is incredibly hard. Even if you don't care about the improves blood magic property, +6 to willpower and spell power is a great bonus. But again, this is an item you'll only have access to if you got that achievement. For amulets, I recommend Amulet of the War Mage. This is a DLC item that gives +5% to damage for all elements. The Blood Gorged Amulet gives +12 to Constitution, and that's pretty nice if you want Morrigan to have some more HP. Pearl of the Anointed is a DLC item that gives +1 to all attributes, and there's a bunch of other amulets, but in my opinion a lot of them are useless, and you can just use Morrigan's starting amulet if you don't have a better one to equip her with. For rings, here are some good ones. The Dalish Promise Ring is pretty nice, but only if you have Dane's Fixes so that the reduces hostility effect works. Dalish Battery gives +10% to electricity damage. Dream Sever gives +10% to spirit damage. Frost Shear gives +10% to cold damage. And Ring of Faith gives +10% to fire damage. The Lucky Stone is a DLC ring that gives +1 to all attributes. There are a few rings that give +5% to damage with a certain element. Personally, I don't bother purchasing them because that 5% is negligible. Morrigan's ring is a pretty funny ring to equip on Morrigan, seeing as she gives this as a gift to a male warden that she's romancing. You can see from the gear sections that mages mainly care about their staff and robes, and even those don't have to be the best in order for a mage to be good. That's just because the spells that mages have access to make them simply more powerful and less gear dependent than the other classes. In conclusion, I think Morrigan is a great mage despite the fact that she has the useless shapeshifter specialization. You recruit her in your party early on enough that you can easily shape her into whatever you'd like, other than a super supporting mage perhaps, which I personally don't like to use anyway. If you do use mods, I recommend using the Respecialization mod on her so that you can take away the points she has in shapeshifting and put them into something useful, but it's definitely not mandatory. This Morrigan build guide was actually requested in the comments section of my Alistair build guide, so if you have a particular guide or any idea for a video that you'd like to see from me, please let me know and I'll add it to the list. I hope you enjoyed this character build guide for Morrigan in Dragon Age Origins. This has been B Tier Mutineer. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next week.